problem. Happy
Um,
2025.
Happy 2025. 2025 started with something that you are very familiar with in the news all over the place, wildfire in an urban environment. How do you
Yes.
follow news stories like that? What do you do as you're watching that news coverage?
Yeah. So wildfires, of course, always make for very flashy news coverage. And obviously the wildfires in the LA area right now are very dramatic, no matter how you look at it. But also I always read news about any natural disaster really with a little grain of skepticism because they're always trying to make it look as terrible as possible. And I don't want to downplay it. Like, this is terrible. I know people have lost their homes, people have lost their lives. Um, but there's also, I know they're looking to, give the biggest numbers possible of the numbers of people affected and areas burned and everything. Um, and so it's not as much with these fires, but in news stories about wildfire in general, there will often be these sensationalist things. Like they'll say, "Oh, this wildfire is so big, it's creating its own weather," and they make it seem like this is the first time this has ever happened. And like, no, actually, when you get a fire big enough, you have a big hot air mass that's going to make some clouds and wind, and technically, yes, it's generating its own weather. Everybody calm down. Yes, it is big, but this isn't some unprecedented thing no one has ever seen before.
So one of the
Um,
things
yeah.
that, wildfires, especially in more remote areas, can get even bigger than the tens of
Mhm.
thousands of acres they describe around LA. Is that also something that you think is sort of lost in the coverage? Is some of the size that happens in of fires that are happening in more remote areas in the American West or in Alaska or in Canada?
Yeah, it can be really hard to wrap your head around the size of some of those remote wildfires. And also the time scales are really different. Some of these remote wildfires, they're going to be burning for months and months at a time, which doesn't mean that a given spot is on fire for months. A given spot may only be burning for a day, or maybe even really only burning for a few hours and then smoldering for a while. But often wildfires are sort of moving in fits and bursts, sometimes moving very quickly, sometimes just creeping along. And somewhere in the fire perimeter is burning um, for months at a time. And these ones in LA have lasted surprisingly long time for where they are. But they are moving very fast, largely because of the Santa Ana winds. Um, it shows you the weather and a lot of that, unfortunately, due to climate change, is really exacerbating how a lot of these fires behave. But I actually know someone who works for CAL FIRE, who was asked if he could come down to Los Angeles to work on a fire and he to work on these fires. And everybody said, "Oh, it's a grass fire. It'll be over in a day. I'm not going to bother going down there." And of course, he was incorrect about that, it turns out. But in general, the shrubby, grassy areas around Los Angeles where the fires are burning, usually those fires are very dramatic, but are over relatively quickly. But these ones are unusual in just how long they're lasting.
I've chosen four papers of yours from the past few years to
Mhm,
ask you specifics about that have a little bit, not so much to do with this specific fire, but your look and your research into fire in general, the resilience of the landscapes, the effect it has on watersheds in the critical zone, and just some of the fuel thoughts that goes. We've talked about that
mhm,
before. So the first one that I asked you about is a paper that was presented during the AGU 23 meeting with the description "Tracking Vegetation Recovery Following Mixed
mhm.
Severity Wildfires in the Sierra Nevada." And so one of the things, from my understanding of wildfire, is that as it disturbs the area of their critical zone, then there becomes a risk of landslides and other things that are happening because those things aren't there. But then the vegetation recovers in their different rates. What have you learned in your research about the recovery of vegetation for landscapes like around LA or in the Sierra Nevada where you study when the plants are coming back?
Mhm. Yeah, well, the recovery can really go a lot of different ways. So there can be increased risk of landslides right after a fire, especially what we call a high severity fire, which is basically where you remove all of the vegetation over a given area. And then it depends a little bit on what the weather's doing after. Like sometimes it's just, kind of bad luck. You have a big fire, and then before any vegetation can come back in, you have a giant rainstorm, and the soil's been disturbed. The vegetation that normally reduces the impact of water on the ground and roots that hold the soil in place are gone. And so that can give you this perfect storm where you have these terrible landslides. But fire can also be beneficial for some kinds of vegetation under the right circumstances. And so part of the title of that paper you're talking about is mixed severity wildfire. And a lot of what I look at is fires that are burning in what I refer to as a more natural way, or what these landscapes are more adapted to, where you might have some little patches of high severity, but the whole area of the fire isn't just void of vegetation after. It's just like there's been, a tree burned down over here, a tree burned down over there, um, some shrubs and grasses cleared away, but not removing everything. And in that case, it can be a really nice situation for a lot of different wildflowers and grasses to grow because they have access to more sun and more water because there's not as much rain being intercepted in the leaves of the trees. And they're not competing with as many trees for water. And one thing we saw using old aerial photos and comparing them to more recent ones, you saw there's a lot of areas in the Sierras where you had some of these more natural mixed severity fires, not big dramatic ones like in LA, and but where there was enough high severity to clear out some patches of trees. In some places, instead of trees growing back right away, you actually get these wet meadows growing back, which are really important hotspots for biodiversity. Wet meadows, you can get lots of different plants and animals and microbes living there. And they're also really important for water resources. Meadows and wetlands help filter pollutants out of the water. They help store water in the ground and release it more slowly throughout the summer, which is good for the vegetation in the area and also good for people downstream because you don't have all the water rushing out in a few floods. You have it being released a little more slowly, and maybe it's a little more usable later into the summer. Um, so yeah, depending on how the fire is behaving, what the land looked like right before the fire, and what your fire weather was, what kind of vegetation you have there, you can have these really bad impacts on the vegetation. Um, or you can have these helpful impacts where you can actually increase the amount of different types of habitat like wet meadows.
Fire is a natural part of any critical zone landscape. It's going to
Yeah.
happen. It's part of what
Mhm.
keeps the whole thing moving around.
Yeah, exactly. And the main thing that's changed with fire in the last several hundred years is people. Well, maybe I shouldn't say several hundred years because there has been, especially in North America, a lot of indigenous fire use, where people actually, used fire as a tool to manage the landscape and keep it more resilient and healthy, and also encourage the growth of certain types of vegetation or keep certain places open so they might be better for hunting or better for the growth of certain kinds of grasses or um, oak trees that are used for various purposes. So people have been interacting with the fire cycle for a very long time, but starting a couple hundred years ago in the United States, sort of two things happened. We started getting better at putting fires out, and well, three things happened. One was we started getting better at putting fires out. Another was we started building all these permanent settlements, towns, in places that turns out were fire prone, and we didn't want those houses to burn down. And then third, a big forestry industry developed in the United States, and we wanted to be able to cut down the trees and build things with them. And we didn't want all that valuable lumber to go up in flame. And so people started changing the Western landscape, especially in the US, to at first not burn as often. And at first that worked great. Because I guess especially about a century ago, technology was improving and the US government put a lot of money into stopping wildfires from burning, protect that valuable timber, protect the houses. And for a while was working really well. But then the fires started getting harder and harder to put out because when you don't have a fire for a long time, then you get all these, dead trees and overgrown bushes and dense grasses that are just getting denser and denser and building up, and all this fuel is piling up. And then you get a hot, dry summer and some fast winds, and then all of a sudden there's just so much fuel for that fire. It can get so big so fast that there's just no way to put it out. And then you build houses in the middle of that, and then people are in danger. And then also you have a different kind of fuel for the fire is when, houses and all different man-made structures burn, then you also have added pollution issues in addition to people losing their homes because you have all the, you know, paints and gasolines and all sort and lead and all these things that are inside of our structures that now are being volatilized or are melting and running off into streams next time it rains.
That's along one of these, a couple of, there's a paper that you were part of called Scientists Warning on
Hmm.
Extreme Wildfire Risks to Water Supply. And that sounds like the lines in something you were just describing.
Yeah.
That maybe some of the, and there's a beautiful figure in that paper that has a whole flow chart of a
Hmm.
wildfire hazard drivers to a watershed response, to the well-being and
Hmm.
outcomes, to the social and economic system impacts, and then
Hmm.
some advice for the government. Sounds like if that's exactly what you're talking about, that people might need to keep in mind as
Hmm.
this particularly very urban area recovers from this wildfire.
Yeah, definitely these urban fires, you especially think about the water quality issues. And then when it's a wildfire in a more rural area, there can also be some water quality issues, but more you think about sediment from those landslides, like you mentioned, coming in, which, may not necessarily be toxic, but it might make it harder to filter the water for people to drink, might add sediment into your reservoirs and make them silt up and not work as well. Also, you can have flooding issues after fires because all that water can move over the landscape so much faster without vegetation in the way. Um, but if you have fire in sort of the right natural amounts, then you can maybe have less flooding because you have more of those meadows that I mentioned that help to store and slow down the water movement. And also, there's all sorts of interactions of fire with snow that I won't get into the details, but in some circumstances, snow can make the snow melt. In some circumstances, fire can make the snow melt faster. In some circumstances, those open areas can actually hold on to the snow longer, which reduces the levels of flooding in the spring. So it's all a lot of different competing interactions.
Many complex systems, perhaps, all working
Yes,
together.
indeed.
As I was doing, you mentioned snow just now, and as I was looking at some papers to pull to talk with you about today, and as you've done a lot of a lot of your recent work has been snowpack and snow melt
Mhm.
and working with snow. Is that a new thing for you to branch into?
I've been looking at it a little bit ever since my PhD, but I'm starting to look more and more at snow. There's just such an interesting and complex part of mountain hydrology, and snow kind of ties a lot of different things together. The snow, takes the precipitation, larger weather and the atmospheric sciences, and then as it falls, it interacts with the vegetation. And then the snow melting affects the stream flow and it affects the soil moisture, which affects how the vegetation can grow, which then affects the snow again, and also the vegetation then affects the fires. which can impact what the snow is going to do. And if the snow sticks around longer, it can keep things wetter, which then makes it less likely to burn. So all these things are affecting each other in different
Amazing
ways.
to, I mean,
Hmm.
no wonder that critical zone science is so collaborative. You really need to be able
Hmm.
to go across disciplines to understand how all those things might affect how people live or how the landscape
Hmm.
reacts and grows and is healthy and
Hmm.
helps maintain places for humans to be and animals as well.
Yeah, and also it makes it hard to fully understand these systems in just like the 3 to 5 year funding cycle that you've probably heard scientists complain about. There can be so much variation from year to year, and a lot of these complex feedbacks really might take decades to actually be able to view them. Um, and so that's a tricky thing with a lot of environmental science projects that involve field measurements is, you get some funding to be able to go out and measure something for a few years, but then that grant ends or the PhD student who was working on that leaves and does something else, and you just get these little snapshots of what's going on. But there's more and more that we can do now with satellite data, which is great because the satellites, have been up there, some of them for decades, observing things, and then can go in and have this nice record that um, no one knew to be looking for this certain thing at this certain spot, but they've just been tracking it along with everywhere else the satellite was flying over, and you can go in and pull out all this information.
It's been waiting for you this whole time.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question. You mentioned a little bit earlier, and we've talked about it before, and it was something that I've heard mentioned, particularly with the LA fires, was the fuel, the dry fuel in that
Hmm.
area. And this paper is Trends in Western USA Fire Fuels using historical data
Hmm.
and modeling from 2022. And when you were reading about the causes of this fire, were you surprised to see that, or was like, of course, it's because there was big growth last year and then a dry year, and then it was just all there waiting to
Hmm.
burn now?
Yeah, well, Southern California, especially, it gets so dry every single summer. Um, and yeah, this year I think was especially dry, but there um did have a bit of that situation, like you said, where it had gotten a lot more rain last year, and that lets the vegetation grow and then dies off in the summer. But yeah, the area and around Los Angeles is just sort of always a risk, no matter what kind of year, because it always is pretty dry in the summertime. Um, there's, I forget the exact statistic, but basically, like every summer in California, there's basically a bigger drought than like most places on the East Coast have ever seen in the last hundreds of years. And it's just that's what the natural seasonal cycle is. Like in a lot of places on the East Coast it'd be unheard of to go 3 months without rain. And in Los Angeles, like, yeah, that happens pretty much every summer.
Thank you so much for taking some time to talk. I know you're very, very busy with your family and your work and all of that sort of stuff. I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk about this fascinating science with me today.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
I'm going to stop recording and then we'll say goodbye off recording.